There's a certain kind of job that only exists in the hours when everyone else is asleep. The people who take these jobs take them for ordinary reasons. The money, the quiet, a fresh start after a hard year. They think the worst thing waiting for them is boredom. They're wrong. So take a deep breath, listen closely, and welcome to Echoes in the Dark. I've been a tower climber for 11 years, and the first thing anyone in this line of work will tell you is that the job doesn't scare you the way people think it should. The height stops mattering almost immediately. Within your first few months, you're 400 feet up in a harness, leaning back off the steel with your whole weight on a lanyard, and your body just quietly accepts that this is normal now. That falling isn't going to happen because you don't let it happen, because you check every connection twice, and you never, ever trust a piece of gear you haven't inspected with your own hands. What the job actually is, most of the time, is lonely. That's the part nobody tells you. It's long drives to remote sites, hours alone at the base of a structure most people never think about, doing careful, methodical work in weather that ranges from unpleasant to genuinely dangerous. The towers are always in the middle of nowhere, because that's where the coverage gaps are. Up on ridgelines, out past the last paved road, in the empty places between the small towns that still need a signal. You spend a lot of time by yourself out there. You get used to it. Some of us even come to like it. I say all this so you understand that I'm not someone who spooks easily, and that I'd spent more nights alone in remote places than I could possibly count before the night I'm going to tell you about. I know what it feels like to be genuinely alone somewhere dark. This was not that feeling. This was the opposite of that feeling, and that's exactly what was wrong with it. The site was a cellular tower up on Cutshin Ridge in the far back part of Hollow County, the kind of county the interstate skips and the maps stop bothering to detail. A lattice tower, maybe 380 feet, standing alone on a bald stretch of ridgeline with nothing around it but the little fenced equipment compound at its base, and a gravel access road that switched backed up from the valley for the better part of 40 minutes. I'd never worked that particular tower before. The company I subcontract for had picked up the maintenance agreement recently, and I was the closest climber they had on call. So when the alarm came in, it came to me. The alarm itself was routine, or should have been. The tower was reporting a fault on one of the upper antenna arrays. A physical problem, most likely. Something a remote reset couldn't fix. Which meant somebody had to actually drive out and climb up and put hands on it. Ordinarily, that's a daytime job. You don't climb at night unless you have to. But this was a carrier site, handling emergency services traffic for a big chunk of the back county. And with the array faulted, a lot of very remote people had no way to call for help. Dispatch wanted it back up before morning. So I loaded my truck a little after 10 at night, and I drove. The access road was worse than I expected. Washed out in places, the gravel gone to loose rock and ruts. And it took me nearly an hour of careful, low-gear crawling to reach the top. When my headlights finally swept across the compound gate, I felt that small, familiar relief you feel arriving anywhere after a bad drive. And then, right behind it, something I didn't have a name for yet. The site felt occupied. That's the only way I can describe the first impression. An empty fenced compound on an empty ridge, and my gut told me, immediately and without any evidence, that I was not the first person there tonight. I put it down to the drive. Long, dark roads do things to your head. I parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. And the ridge outside was exactly what it should have been. The tower a black lattice against a slightly less black sky. The little equipment shelter squatting inside the fence. The wind moving steadily across the bald in the way wind does up high. Constant and indifferent. Nothing was wrong. I told myself nothing was wrong. And I got out of the truck. The first genuinely odd thing was the shelter door. The equipment shelter is a small windowless building, basically a steel box full of the radios and batteries and switching gear that make the tower work. It's kept locked. I had the access code, and when I got to the door, it was already unlocked. Not forced, not damaged, just unlatched. Standing a half-inch open, the way you'd leave a door if you'd stepped out and meant to come right back. I stood there looking at it for a while. A site like this gets visited maybe a few times a year. The odds that someone had been here recently enough to leave it open, on this specific night, were not good. I want to be honest that my first thought was entirely mundane. Copper thieves, vandals, someone breaking into the site to strip it for metal, which is a real and constant problem with remote infrastructure. That thought actually made me feel better, because it was a human problem with a human explanation, and I stood at that half-open door for a good minute, preparing myself to find the inside stripped and wrecked. It wasn't. The inside of the shelter was pristine. Every cabinet closed, every cable in place, the gear humming along in the cool air the way it's supposed to. Nothing had been touched. Whoever had opened the door hadn't taken anything, hadn't damaged anything, had apparently just opened it and left it that way. And on the little fold-down work desk against the far wall, under the dim glow of the shelter's single interior light, there was a maintenance logbook. Every site has one. It's a physical paper log, a holdover from before everything went digital, and most techs barely use them anymore. You're supposed to sign in, note the work you did, sign out, but half the time people just do it in the app and never touch the paper book at all. This one was the standard issue, a hardbound log with the carrier's logo on the cover, and it was sitting open, roughly in the middle, as though someone had been writing in it recently and hadn't closed it. I picked it up mostly out of habit. You get in the reflex of checking the log to see who was on site last and what they did, so you know the history of any given piece of equipment. I turned to the first page, expecting the usual sparse, boring entries. Install date, commissioning notes, a handful of maintenance visits spread over the years, each one a few dry lines. That's exactly what the early pages were. Dry, procedural, spaced months apart. The tower had been commissioned years ago and visited only a handful of times since. A battery replacement, an antenna swap, a couple of routine inspections. Ordinary. Boring. The kind of history every tower has. I flipped forward toward the recent entries to see who'd been the last one up before me. The last several pages were filled in with the same handwriting. Close, careful, a little cramped. A climber's handwriting, someone used to filling out forms with cold hands. And the entries were dated over the past several weeks, one almost every night, which made no sense at all because a site like this doesn't get nightly visits. It gets a visit when something breaks, and nothing had been breaking here, not according to the alarm history I'd reviewed before driving out. As far as the network was concerned, this tower had been quietly healthy until tonight. I started reading the recent entries, and this is the part I've never been able to explain to anyone in a way that makes them understand why it bothered me so much. Because written out plainly, it doesn't sound like much. The entries were mine. Not literally signed with my name. There was no name on them at all, actually. But the handwriting was my handwriting. I know my own handwriting. Anyone would. And these entries, dated over weeks I had provably spent nowhere near this tower, were written in it, describing maintenance visits to this site, this tower, in the small, careful print I've been filling out work logs with for 11 years. I stood in that shelter with the book in my hands, and my first, desperate, entirely reasonable thought was that someone was messing with me. A coworker, a prank, some elaborate setup. But I've worked with these people for years, and this isn't the kind of prank anyone I know would drive 40 minutes up a washed-out mountain road alone, at night, week after week, to pull. And the more I looked at the handwriting, the more certain I became that no one had faked it. The little quirks were all there, the way I close my A's, the way I never quite finish my Y's, the particular slant. It was mine. I hadn't written it, but it was mine. I read the entries in order, because I couldn't not. The early ones were normal, almost aggressively normal. Arrived on site, inspected lower array, no faults found, departed. The kind of thing you'd write on a routine visit that turned up nothing. But there were dozens of them, dated night after night, describing me arriving at this tower and finding nothing wrong and leaving again, over and over, for weeks. Then, maybe 2/3 of the way through, the entries started to change. Same handwriting, same dry, procedural tone, but the content began to shift, gradually, the way the temperature drops so slowly on an autumn evening that you don't notice you're cold until you already are. Arrived on site, something on the upper array, could not identify from the ground, did not climb, Departed. Arrived on site. The thing on the upper array is still there. It was not there during the day inspection last month. It is only visible at night. Did not climb. Arrived on site. It is moved lower on the tower, approximately 300 feet now, holding position on the north face. Did not climb. I looked up from the book through the open shelter door, out at the black lattice of the tower against the sky. From where I stood, I couldn't see the upper structure clearly, just the lower legs disappearing up into the dark. The wind pushed steadily against the shelter. I told myself, with the small remaining rational part of my mind, that I was reading the private breakdown of some other climber, that the handwriting only looked like mine, that exhaustion and a bad drive and a spooky remote site were making me see a resemblance that wasn't really there. It was a thin explanation. I held on to it anyway. I kept reading. Arrived on site, 200 feet now. It has the right number of arms and legs, but they do not bend the right way. It stays very still when I look directly at it. It moves when I look at the equipment instead. Arrived on site, 100 feet. I can see it better now than I want to. It is climbing down the way I climb. It has watched me climb enough times to know how it is done. Arrived on site. It was at the base tonight, standing at the bottom of the tower where I clip in. I did not get out of the truck. I filled this out from the truck. I'm going to stop coming here. I'm going to tell them to send someone else. And then, in the same handwriting, on the next line, dated the same night, I did not write that last entry. I have never been to this tower. I do not know why my hand knows this book. I closed the book. I want to describe exactly what I did in that moment, because I've thought about it many times since, and I think it was the smartest thing I did all night. I did not run. I did not throw the book down and bolt for the truck. Some deep, steady, professional part of me, the part that's kept me alive on steel for 11 years, the part that checks every connection twice, took over, and it said, very calmly, you don't have all the information yet, and panic gets people killed. So I set the book down gently on the desk, exactly where I'd found it, and I made myself think. There was a real alarm. That was the fixed point I kept returning to. A real network-generated fault on the upper array had brought me here, and real people down in the valley had no way to call for help until it was fixed. Whatever was going on with the book, the job was real, and the job was the reason I was standing here. Ordinarily, that fault meant a climb. Ordinarily, I'd already be gearing up. I stepped out of the shelter and looked up at the tower for a long time, letting my eyes fully adjust to the dark, tracing the lattice upward from the base to as high as I could follow it against the sky. There was something on the upper array. I'm not going to pretend I saw it clearly, because I didn't, and I've never trusted the accounts of people who claim they saw impossible things in perfect detail in the dark. What I saw was a shape, up near the top of the tower, roughly 350 feet up, on the north face, near the faulted array. Darker than the steel around it, about the size a person would be. It was not moving. And the longer I stared at it, the more certain I became of two things. That it had the general shape of a climber, clipped in near the top the way I would be if I were up there, and that it was, in some way I couldn't have proven to anyone, aware of me looking at it. I looked away, deliberately, back down at the equipment shelter, and in the very edge of my vision, in the part of your sight that catches motion better than detail, the shape on the tower shifted. Not while I was looking at it. The instant I looked away. I looked back up. It was lower. Not by much, but lower. I understood then, with total clarity, what the entries in that book had been telling me. It moved when you looked at the equipment instead. It came down the way a climber comes down, because it had watched climbers do it, over and over, night after night, learning. And every entry in that book had ended the same way, with the same two words, over and over, dozens of times. A discipline held onto by whoever, whatever, had been keeping that log. Did not climb. That was the rule. I understood it the way you understand a rule you were never told, but somehow always knew. Whatever that thing was, it lived on the tower, and the tower was its ground. And the one thing every version of me in that book had done, the thing that had apparently kept every one of them alive across all those nights, was refuse to put a single hand on that steel. Did not climb. Did not climb. Did not climb. And the one entry that broke the pattern, the one where it came down to the base and stood where I clip in, that was the night the writing changed. That was the night the log stopped being a record of a man doing his job and started being something else writing in a man's hand. I did not climb. I want to be very clear about that, because everything in my training and 11 years of professional pride told me to gear up and go fix the fault. And there were real people in the valley who needed that array back online. But I stood at the base of that tower, gear still in the truck, and I looked up at the shape that was lower now than it had been a minute ago, and I made the only decision that mattered. I got back in my truck. I called dispatch from the cab and I told them the site was unsafe to climb, which was true, and that I was recommending a daytime crew of at least 2, which was also true, and I did not tell them why, because there was no version of why that wouldn't have ended my career. The dispatcher was annoyed. The array stayed down. I did not care. I started the engine. Here's the part I've never been able to shake. As I turned the truck around in the compound, my headlights swept across the base of the tower, across the spot where a climber clips in to start a climb. And for just the fraction of a second that the light was on it, I saw the shape standing there. At the bottom now, off the steel, on the ground, where the log said it had been on the very last real entry, the night before the handwriting stopped being a man's. It had the right number of arms and legs. They did not bend the right way. And it was standing exactly the way I stand when I'm about to begin a climb, checking my gear, one hand raised to the first rung, mimicking, patiently, the one motion it had watched a man perform more times than either of us could count. I did not stop. I drove down that washed-out road faster than I should have, faster than was safe, and I did not look in the mirror, because some part of me understood that looking away from the road to look behind me was exactly the kind of thing it was waiting for. I made it to the valley as the sky was starting to gray toward morning, and I pulled over at the first gas station I found, the last stop place at the bottom of the ridge, and I sat in the lot until it was fully light, and there were other people around, and the ordinary world had reassembled itself into something I could believe in again. I never went back to Cutshin Ridge. I told the company I was declining that site permanently, and when they pushed for a reason, I gave them the true one, that isn't the whole one, that it wasn't safe, that it needed a daytime crew, that I wouldn't climb it alone. They sent someone else, eventually, in daylight, with a partner. That climber found the upper array faulted exactly as reported, fixed it in under an hour, signed the log, and came down without incident, and told me afterward that the site was totally unremarkable, and he had no idea what my problem had been. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether he'd read the old entries in the logbook. He gave me a strange look and said the log was nearly empty. A few install notes, a couple of maintenance visits, nothing else. Dozens of blank pages. I didn't argue with him. I've stopped trying to make people believe the parts that can't be believed. But I still do this work. I still drive the long, dark roads out to the remote sites, still climb the towers alone, still fill out the logs in my small, careful print. And every single time I open a site logbook now, before I read a word of it, I check the handwriting. I check to see whether any of the entries are already mine. So far, they never have been. But I check every time. And on the nights when a site feels occupied the way that one did, when an empty place on an empty ridge somehow feels like I'm not the first one there, I don't climb. I don't care what the alarm says. I don't care who's waiting on the signal down in the valley. I write the same 3 words every climber before me apparently learned to write, in the log, in my own hand, and I get back in my truck, and I drive. Did not climb. I took the overnight security position at the Hallbrook Tower because it paid better than almost anything else I was qualified for, and because the hours worked well with the online classes I was taking during the day. 12 stories of leased office space downtown, mostly insurance companies and a marketing firm on the top 2 floors, completely empty between 8 at night and 6 in the morning, except for whoever was unlucky enough to be working the overnight security desk. I want to say up front that I'd worked security before, at a much smaller building, and I'd never once had a night that felt like anything more than long, boring hours and bad coffee. I want that understood clearly, because I think it matters. I wasn't someone who went looking for something like this. It found me instead, tucked into a drawer I had no real reason to open. My first night on the job, my supervisor, a brisk, no-nonsense woman named Denise, walked me through the basics. The patrol route, the camera monitoring station, the badge system, the handful of doors that needed manual checks each round because their electronic locks were older than the rest of the building's security infrastructure. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought while showing me the desk itself, that the previous overnight guard, a man named Curtis Ambrose, had left the position rather abruptly a few months earlier. "Family stuff, I think," she said, in the particular tone people use when they either don't know the real reason or don't want to say it. "He was here almost 4 years. Good guard. Kept meticulous notes, actually. Probably still in the desk somewhere if you're into that kind of thing." I was, as it turned out, into that kind of thing. The same way I'd been into Denny Vance's old logbook on an entirely different job, months before this one. A small, persistent curiosity about the people who'd done a job before me. The kind of curiosity that has, on more than one occasion in my life, led me somewhere I wish it hadn't. I found Curtis's notebook on my third shift, tucked in the back of the desk's bottom drawer beneath a stack of old parking validation slips. A simple black composition notebook, half-filled, his handwriting neat and orderly in a way that suggested someone methodical, someone who took the job seriously even in its quietest hours. The first several weeks of entries were exactly what you'd expect from a careful overnight guard. Patrol times, minor incidents, a note about a malfunctioning door sensor on the 7th floor, a reminder to follow up with building maintenance about a flickering light in the stairwell. It read almost like a diary, written by someone who genuinely didn't mind the solitude of the job, who'd found a kind of steady peace in the routine of it. Then, a few months in, the entries began to shift. 11:47 p.m. Heard something on the 9th floor during my 11:30 round. Sounded like a chair rolling across the floor. Checked. Office was locked, dark, no one inside. Probably HVAC settling. Building's old. I remember reading that entry with mild, distant interest. The kind of interest you give a story that doesn't yet feel like it belongs to you. I had almost 3 hours left on my own shift that night, and I kept reading, mostly to pass the time. 1:15 a.m. Chair sound again. Same floor, same rough time. Starting to notice a pattern. Going to check the 9th floor thoroughly next round. 1:20 a.m. Check thoroughly. Nothing. But notice the executive conference room chair, the good one, leather, at the head of the table, was pulled out slightly further than it should be. I always push those in at the end of my last full sweep. I know I did that night. The entries continued in that same careful, methodical style for the next several pages. Small anomalies noted and dismissed, the way any diligent employee might note something slightly off without immediately assuming the worst. It was almost soothing to read, in its own way. Curtis's calm, procedural voice, describing things that should have alarmed him more than they seemed to, at least at first. It was around the notebook's halfway point that the tone began, gradually, to change. I've started calling it the tenant in my head, which I know is a strange thing to write down, but I don't have a better word for it. Whatever's happening on the 9th floor at night, it feels less like a malfunction and more like something that's actually there, using the space the way the marketing firm uses it during the day. I don't know how else to explain the chair, the temperature changes, the sense, and I know how this sounds, of being watched from inside offices I've already checked and know are empty. I checked the clock on the wall above the desk. It was a little past midnight on my own shift, the 9th floor sitting silent and dark on the monitoring station's grid of small camera feeds. Nothing unusual visible in any of them. I told myself, the way I imagine most people would, that Curtis had simply spent too many long, solitary nights in an empty building. That isolation does strange things to perfectly rational people, myself very much included if I let it. I kept reading anyway. It knows my patrol schedule. I don't know how else to explain what happened tonight. I varied my route deliberately, went ninth floor first instead of last, specifically to see if that changed anything. The chair was still moved by the time I got there, but moved in a way that suggested it had been waiting for me on my usual route and had to reposition once it realized I'd changed my pattern. I know that sounds insane. I'm writing it down anyway. I brought this up to Denise, carefully, without saying too much. She just said the building's old, older employees have said similar things over the years, and it's never amounted to anything worth investigating further. I got the sense she didn't want to talk about it more than that. The same careful non-answer I've started to recognize whenever I bring up the ninth floor to anyone who's worked here longer than me. I glanced at the monitoring station again, an old habit already forming even this early into reading, and felt a small, unreasonable relief at seeing every feed exactly as still and empty as it should have. The entries continued to escalate from there. Gradually, the way I'd learned escalation tends to happen in accounts like this. Not through sudden shocks, but through a slow accumulation of small, specific details that individually could be explained away and collectively could not. It started leaving the conference room door open, every night now, always exactly 1 inch. Measured, I checked with a ruler out of some morbid curiosity. Not ajar by accident, precisely, deliberately, exactly 1 inch, every single night, no matter how many times I close it fully on my last sweep. Temperature drop confirmed with the building's own sensors tonight, not just my own sense of it. The ninth floor conference room registered 11 degrees colder than the rest of the floor for a period of roughly 20 minutes. No HVAC malfunction on record. No explanation from building engineering. I found handwriting on the conference room whiteboard tonight. Not mine. Not anyone's I recognize from the marketing firm's daytime staff, according to the samples Denise let me compare against old meeting notes. Just my name, written small, in the corner, like something being noted down for reference. I erased it. It was back, in the same spot, by my next round. I stopped reading for a moment at that entry, aware of a specific, prickling awareness of my own name. Mine, not Curtis's, sitting unwritten but somehow implied in the space where his had been. I told myself it was simply the natural effect of reading an unsettling account alone in a quiet building at 1 a.m, and that was, in fairness, at least partially true. I kept reading, because by that point, I've never been good at leaving something unfinished. A flaw I've had confirmed to me more than once in exactly this kind of situation. The final several entries in the notebook were dated closer together, days apart rather than the weeks-long gaps of earlier sections, the handwriting slightly less steady than it had been at the start, though still recognizably careful, recognizably Curtis. I asked for a shift change. Denise said there isn't one available right now, that this is the position as it exists, take it or leave it. I need this job. I have 2 kids and an ex-wife who isn't especially patient about late support payments. I can't just walk away from steady work over something I can't even properly explain to anyone without sounding unstable. It touched me tonight. I don't know how else to say that plainly. I was doing my 9th floor round, conference room door open its usual precise inch, and something, cold, deliberate, unmistakably a hand despite there being no visible source for it, rested briefly on my shoulder from behind. I didn't turn around immediately. I don't fully know why. When I did turn, there was nothing there, but the shoulder of my uniform jacket was damp afterward, in a specific handprint shape, like something wet and cold had genuinely gripped me there. I think it's not trying to hurt me. Not yet, anyway. I think it's testing something. How close it can get before I react. How much I'll tolerate before I do something about it. I don't know what happens once it finishes testing. I'm not sure I want to find out. But I also don't know how to stop finding out. Short of quitting a job, I genuinely cannot afford to lose. There were only a handful of entries left after that, spaced only a day or 2 apart, the handwriting noticeably tighter, smaller, pressed harder into the page in a way I recognized uncomfortably well from another notebook, on another job, months earlier. It followed me to the lobby tonight. First time it's left the 9th floor, as far as I've noticed. I felt the temperature drop at the elevator bank, all the way down at ground level, security desk included. I don't think the floor is the boundary anymore, if it ever really was one. I'm putting in my notice tomorrow. I know I said I couldn't afford to, and that's still true, but I don't think I have much choice left in the matter anymore. I don't want to say more than that. If you're reading this, whoever takes this job after me, watch the 9th floor conference room. Watch the temperature. And if you ever feel a hand on your shoulder up there, don't turn around slowly. Get to the stairwell. Don't wait to see what it looks like. I almost did, tonight, and some old, useful part of my brain stopped me before I could. The final entry was shorter than any of the others, dated almost exactly 4 months before my first shift. The handwriting barely legible in places, as though written in a hurry, or with hands that weren't entirely steady. Last shift tonight. Don't know who's reading this next, but please, take the warnings seriously. It's not malicious exactly, not yet, but I don't think not yet is a permanent condition. I think it's patient. I think it's been patient for a very long time, with whoever came before me too, and I don't know what happens to patience once it finally runs out. Below that, nothing. Blank pages, the rest of the notebook empty, the same unfinished quality I recognized instantly, my stomach going tight and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. I looked at the monitoring station. It was almost 2 a.m. My next scheduled round included the 9th floor. I want to be honest that I considered, seriously, simply skipping that portion of my route for the night, logging a false completion the way I imagine more than one tired guard has done over the years, for far less compelling reasons. But the job required actual verification through badge scans at specific checkpoints on each floor. A system installed, I now realized with grim clarity, sometime after Curtis's tenure. Likely, I suspected, because of exactly the kind of incomplete rounds a frightened guard might otherwise be tempted to fake. I made my rounds on schedule, floors 1 through 8 uneventful in the specific, hyper-aware way that comes from expecting something and getting nothing. Each empty office feeling slightly louder in its silence than it should have. The 9th floor's temperature difference was immediate and unmistakable the moment the elevator doors opened. Not subtle. Not something I could have talked myself out of noticing. A clear, distinct cold that had no business existing in a building with functioning, recently serviced climate control. The conference room door at the end of the hall stood open exactly 1 inch. I completed the badge scan at the required checkpoint with hands that were not entirely steady. And I want to be honest that every reasonable impulse in me was screaming to simply turn around, take the stairwell down, log the round as complete, and deal with any consequences of an incomplete camera timestamp later, whatever they might be. I did not listen to that impulse immediately. I've never been especially proud of that decision, looking back, though I understand now, with the particular clarity that comes after surviving something, exactly why I made it. Curtis's notebook, sitting in my mind as vividly as if I'd just set it down, described a presence that tested boundaries gradually, that hadn't yet crossed into genuine violence during his own tenure. I told myself, in the reckless logic of someone alone at 2 a.m. who has already made up their mind, that I had time, that whatever this was operated slowly, that I could simply glance into the conference room, confirm what I already suspected, and leave. I was wrong about the time I had. I understand that now with a clarity I very much wish I'd had in that hallway. The conference room, when I pushed the door open the rest of the way, was empty in the ordinary sense. No visible figure, no obvious source for the cold that had settled into the space like something with actual weight and presence. The leather chair at the head of the table was pulled out, exactly as Curtis's notebook had described, months and presumably many nights after his final entry. I took a single step into the room, close enough to see my own breath fogging faintly in air that should never have been that cold in a functioning modern office building. And that was when the door behind me swung shut on its own, the latch catching with an audible, unmistakable click. I want to describe what happened next as precisely as I can, because I've gone over it more times than I can count since, trying to make the sequence make sense in a way that satisfies the part of my brain that still wants an ordinary explanation. The temperature dropped further, sharply, cold enough that my breath came out in thick, visible clouds, and my exposed hands began to ache within seconds. The overhead lights, steady and fluorescent a moment earlier, began to flicker in a rapid, uneven pattern that had nothing in common with an ordinary electrical fault. And behind me, close enough that I felt it before I consciously registered any sound at all, something exhaled. A long, slow, deliberate breath against the back of my neck, cold enough that it raised the hair on my arms beneath my uniform jacket. I turned against every piece of advice Curtis had left specifically warning me not to, and for one brief, terrible instant, I saw something standing far closer than any person should have been able to close the distance in complete silence. Tall, indistinct at the edges in a way that made my eyes want to slide off it rather than focus, a suggestion of a face rather than any clear features, and where its hand should have been, resting now not on my shoulder, but closing directly around my wrist, an unmistakable, crushing cold that I felt, immediately and unmistakably, as genuine physical pain. I don't fully remember deciding to fight back. I remember pulling, hard, wrenching my arm free with a desperate strength I didn't know I had, stumbling backward into the conference table hard enough to bruise my hip badly against its edge, and scrambling for the door with a panic that overrode every rational thought except the single, overwhelming need to get out of that room. The door, which had swung shut and latched on its own, did not open easily. I want to be honest that for several of the longest seconds of my life, I genuinely believed I was going to be trapped in that room with whatever was closing the distance behind me again, its cold presence unmistakable at my back, even without turning to confirm it. The handle finally gave, whether through my own increasingly frantic effort or some shift in whatever had been holding it, and I threw myself into the hallway, colder air rushing past me as the door swung wide. I did not stop moving until I reached the stairwell, taking the 9 flights down 2 and 3 steps at a time, my wrist throbbing with a deep, unnatural ache that felt entirely unlike any bruise I'd ever had before, my hip screaming with every impact against the stairs. I burst into the lobby, badge scanner and monitoring station both mercifully, blessedly ordinary in the fluorescent light, and did not stop moving until I was outside the building entirely, standing on the sidewalk in the cold night air, gasping, my whole body shaking in a way that had very little to do with the actual temperature outside. I called Denise from the sidewalk, incoherent at first, eventually managing to explain enough that she agreed, with a carefulness in her voice that told me she'd had a version of this conversation before, that I didn't need to go back inside that night, that someone else would cover the rest of the shift, that we'd talk properly in the morning. I looked at my wrist under the streetlight while I waited for my ride. Even in that dim, orange-tinted light, I could see the marks already forming. Not quite a bruise in the ordinary sense, paler than a bruise should be. 4 narrow lines pressed deep enough into the skin that I could feel each one individually with my other hand, cold to the touch in a way that lingered for hours afterward, long after I was home, long after the building itself was miles behind me. I did not go back to that job. I want to be honest that I understand, financially, how reckless that decision was, given how much I needed steady work at the time. But there are some costs, I've come to believe firmly since that night, that simply aren't worth paying twice. Denise, to her credit, didn't push back when I gave my notice, effective immediately, no 2 weeks required. I got the distinct sense, in the careful, measured way she accepted my resignation, that she'd been through this particular conversation more than once before, with more than one guard, and had simply learned, over time, not to ask too many follow-up questions. The marks on my wrist took almost 3 weeks to fully fade, longer than any ordinary bruise, tender to the touch the entire time, in a way that felt distinctly different from typical healing. Cold, specifically, whenever the temperature outside dropped, as though some faint echo of that room's unnatural chill had settled permanently into that small patch of skin. It's been just over a year now. I work a different job, daytime hours, in a building with windows that actually let in daylight, and I've never once regretted the pay cut that came with the change. But I still, on the rare occasions my wrist aches in cold weather, find myself glancing instinctively behind me, the way you check a mirror out of habit, rather than any real expectation of seeing something there. I never did find out what happened to Curtis Ambrose after he left that job, whether he found somewhere safer to work, whether the thing on the 9th floor ever followed him, the way it followed me down 9 flights of stairs that night. I think about him sometimes, though, especially in cold weather, and I hope, genuinely and specifically, that wherever he ended up, he found a building with better light and quieter nights, and no notebooks left waiting in the bottom drawer of anyone's desk. The Ridgeline Motel sits about 2/3 of the way up the Old Ridge Road, in the part of Hollow County where the towns thin out and the trees close in, and it exists for exactly one reason. It's the last place to sleep before the road climbs up into the Cutshin wilderness and stops being the kind of road you want to drive tired. 11 rooms in a single low row, a gravel lot, a buzzing sign that only half lights up anymore, and a small front office with a desk and a landline, and a guest register that, when I started, I assumed was just for show. I took the overnight desk job because I needed something quiet. I'd come off a bad year, the details of which don't matter here, and the idea of sitting alone in a small warm office from 10 at night to 6 in the morning sounded less like work than like recovery. The owner, a tired woman named Peggy who ran the place from a house 2 miles down the road, hired me over the phone and met me exactly once, to hand me the keys and walk me through a job that took about 4 minutes to explain. Guests check in, you give them a key, you write them in the register. There was a computer, technically, but Peggy didn't trust it, and neither did the road, so the real record was the paper book. A big, hard-bound register on the desk, 1 line per guest, name, room, check-in, check-out, all in ink. Write everyone down, Peggy told me, in a tone that had something underneath it I didn't catch at the time. Every guest, every night, in the book. And the rooms are 1 through 11. There's no room 6 on the board. If you ever see a key for 6, you come find me before you do anything else. Not after, before. I thought it was the harmless superstition of someone who'd run a failing motel too long. There were clearly 11 rooms. I could count the doors. I told her, sure, of course. And I meant it about as much as you mean anything you say to be polite. The first couple of weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. The Ridgeline ran maybe a third full on a good night, mostly truckers and the occasional lost tourist. I'd check them in, write them in the book, hand them a key, and sit in the warm little office while the wind came down off the ridge and the sign buzzed and nothing happened. It was the most peaceful job I'd ever had, and I want that on record, because the peace is why I was slow to understand what I was looking at when it started. When you're grateful for how little is happening, you don't go looking for the thing that's wrong. The board on the office wall had 11 hooks, 1 through 11, left to right, each with a numbered tag. I'd checked it 100 times without ever really looking at it, which is why it took me until my 3rd week to notice that there were 12 hooks, and that the extra one, tucked at the far right end just past 11, had a key on it, and that the tag on that key said 6. I stood there staring at it for a while. There was a room 6 in the row, of course. 6 was between 5 and 7, it had to be. But it had never once been rented on any of my nights. Its key had never moved, and the board had a separate hook for it, off at the end, out of sequence, as though someone had deliberately pulled it out of the normal order so they'd notice the moment it changed. I remembered what Peggy said. If you ever see a key for 6, you come find me before you do anything. But the key was on its hook. Nothing had changed. So I let it be, and I sat down, and I had a normal night. The next night, the room 6 key was gone from its hook. I'd relieved the evening girl at 10 and checked the board out of the new habit I'd formed, and the odd extra hook at the end was empty. I asked her, before she left, whether she'd rented 6. She went very still. I don't touch 6, she said. Nobody rents 6. Did you call Peggy? I said I hadn't, that I'd only just noticed. She looked at me for a second like she was deciding something, and then she picked up her bag and left much faster than usual, and I heard her car spray gravel out of the lot like she was glad to be gone. I should have called Peggy. I want to be honest that I didn't, and that everything after is downstream of that. I told myself it was late, that it was probably nothing, that I'd mention it at the end of the shift. I opened the register instead to see if maybe the evening girl had written a 6 entry she'd forgotten about. There was an entry for room 6. It hadn't been there when I flipped through the book at check-in, I was nearly sure. It was there now, and it was in my handwriting. I know my own hand. Anyone does. The 6 line was written in it. My slant, the way I close my letters. Recording a guest checked into room 6 that night. Check-in dated that night, and the checkout column blank. I had not written it. I had been sitting at the desk. The book had been in front of me the whole time. The name on the line wasn't a name, just a word the ink lost confidence in partway through and trailed off. I'm not going to write it here. I've decided against it, and I'd ask you to trust that. And down the row, faint through the office window, from the direction of room 6, I could hear someone writing. The unhurried scratch of a pen on paper, patient, steady, from a room I had not checked anyone into. Up to this point in the story, I've told it the way it happened to me. Slow, uncertain, a series of small, wrong things I kept explaining away. I'm going to stop softening it now, because the night stopped softening it for me. I walked down to room 6. I told myself I was going to knock and find some trucker who'd let himself into an out-of-service room, and I was going to be irritated and professional about it. The lot was mostly empty. 2 trucks at the far end, dark windows everywhere. Room 6 was second from the office. Its curtains were drawn, but the light was on behind them, low and yellow, and a shape moved slowly across the gap, and the pen scratch got louder as I got closer, and under it now there was another sound I hadn't heard from the office. A low, wet, continuous muttering. The cadence of someone reading aloud what they were writing, in a voice with no roof to its mouth. I did not knock. Whatever animal part of me had been quiet all my peaceful weeks woke up all at once and told me in no uncertain terms to go back. I went back. And I finally, 3 weeks too late, called Peggy. She answered on the first ring, already awake, already braced. When I told her the 6 key was gone and there was an entry in the book in my hand, she said one word. Damn it. Quiet and exhausted. And then she told me what I should have been told on day 1, fast, because she said we were already behind. Room 6 was empty. That was the whole problem. It had been empty a long time, longer than she'd owned the place, and it did not like being empty, and it had learned that the way to stop being empty was to be written down. A guest in the book was a guest that was allowed to be there. So it used the clerk, your hand, your record, your say-so, to write itself in. Most nights, if you let it write and did nothing else, it took its one night in the book and checked itself out by dawn and went back to being an empty room, and no one got hurt. But there were rules, and I'd already broken one. You went and looked, she said. Didn't you? You went down and you got close to the door. I said I had. She was quiet for a second. It doesn't just want to be written down, she said. That's how it starts, when it's weak, when it's been empty a long time. But every time someone gives it attention, looks at it, listens to it, comes to the door, it gets a little more real. A guest in a book is a small thing. A guest you've seen is bigger. You've been feeding it for 3 weeks without knowing, every time you noticed that key, and tonight you walked right up to it. It's not going to be satisfied with a line in the book tonight. It knows you're there now. It knows the clerk is real too. I asked her what that meant, what it actually meant. It means don't let it finish the entry, she said. The checkout column is blank. As long as it's blank, that guest has no end to its stay. It's checked in with no reason to ever leave. You have to write a checkout time on that line yourself, tonight, before dawn, or it doesn't go back to being empty at 6. It stays. And a thing like that, once it's stayed past a morning, doesn't stay in room 6. It comes to the desk. It comes to whoever kept the book. I'm 2 miles down the road, and I can't get to you before it's fully dark real, so you're going to have to do this yourself. Write it out. I sat down at the register with a pen, and I put it to the blank checkout column. And that is when the office door, which I had locked, rattled in its frame. Not a knock. A slow testing pull on the handle from outside, the way you check a door you already intend to open. I looked up. Through the office window, standing in the wash of the half-lit sign, was the guest from room 6. I'm not going to pretend I saw it clearly, because I didn't. It was tall. Too tall. Its head above the top of the window frame, so I couldn't see its face, only the long body and the way it stood pressed close to the glass, one hand flat against it. The hand was wrong. Too many joints in the fingers, and they bent the wrong way when they flexed. Slow against the window, leaving no mark on the glass, no fog of breath, nothing, as though it were pressing against the outside of a photograph. And it was writing. The other hand, down at its side, was moving in the air in small, patient scratching motions, writing on nothing, and every motion it made, my own hand on the register jumped to match, the pen dragging across the paper against my will, filling the check-in details fuller, fatter, more, making the guest more real with every stroke it forced out of me. I understood then what Peggy meant about the two of us being the same. It wasn't writing itself in anymore. It was writing itself in through me, and the closer it got, the less my hand was mine. I watched the pen start to move toward the top of the line, toward the name field, and I watched it begin to shape letters that weren't the not name from before. Letters that were my name, my actual name, going down on the room 6 line in my own hand, because Peggy had told me the last and worst part in the truck fast version, and I'd barely heard it. If the guest and the clerk are the same person, it never has to check out at all. You're already here, every night, forever. The door handle turned all the way. I did the only thing left. I did not fight my hand. I couldn't, it wasn't mine anymore. So instead I threw my whole body sideways and dragged the pen with it, off the name, down to the checkout column, and I used every bit of strength I had to force those foreign fingers to write one thing before they finished my name. A time, a morning, 6 a.m., an ending, a way out. I gouged it into the paper so hard the nib tore through the page, and I screamed it out loud at the same time, the way Peggy said to read it as you write it. Checked out at 6 a.m., checked out, gone by morning. Like a rule being enforced, like a sentence being handed down. Everything stopped. The pen stopped. My hand was mine again, cramped and shaking around it. The pressure at the door was gone. When I made myself look up, the window was empty, just the buzzing sign and the empty lot and the dark row of doors. And in my ruined handwriting on the room 6 line, there was a check-in with no name, the name field torn and blank where I dragged the pen away from it, and a checkout time gouged deep. 6 a.m. I did not move from that desk until dawn. I did not go near room 6. When the light finally came up gray over the ridge, the extra hook at the end of the board had its key back on it, and when I made myself walk down and open the door, the room was empty and cold, the bed made, the curtains still. The only thing out of place was the little writing desk against the far wall. There was one sheet of the motel's cheap stationery on it, and it had a single line of writing, and the writing was mine, and it said only, almost. Peggy came at 7. She read the torn line in the register and the blank name field, and she let out a long breath and told me I'd done it right, that I'd caught it at the door, which almost nobody did, that the ones who didn't catch it at the door were why she kept 6 off the board and the key on its own hook, and why she'd told me, first thing, to call her before. I asked her why she didn't just burn the whole place down. She said she'd thought about it more times than she could count. She said she was fairly sure it wouldn't help. She said a thing that's learned to live in a record doesn't need the building. It needs someone to keep writing it down, and there would always be a road and a last motel on it, and a tired person at a desk who needed the quiet. I quit that morning. I didn't work another night. I told Peggy she needed to warn the next clerk on day 1. All of it. The board and the key and the checkout time and the name, and she said she always tried to, and that some of them listened and some of them didn't, the same as me, and that the ones who didn't listen were a different kind of story than the one I got to walk away from. I still drive past the Ridgeline sometimes, in daylight, on my way through that part of the county. The sign still only half lights, the lots still mostly empty, and room 6, second from the office, always has its curtains drawn. day and night, every single time I pass. Which is strange for an empty room, in a motel that swears to anyone who asks that nobody's staying in it at all. I check my own handwriting now, by the way. It's a habit I can't shake. Every form I sign, every note I leave, I look at it twice to make sure it's still only saying what I meant it to say. So far, it always has. But I keep checking, because I gouged a checkout time into that book so it would leave by morning. And it did. It left. It didn't say it wouldn't come back. And the last thing it wrote in my hand on that sheet of cheap stationery in an empty room wasn't goodbye. It was almost. That's where we'll leave it tonight. If these stories kept you company tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next journey into the unknown. And if you've got a story of your own, something that found you alone in the small hours, when you were the only one awake, email it to us. We may just tell it here someday. Until then, remember, the worst thing waiting on the night shift was never the boredom.